licencias obligatorias de patentes en el contexto de la pandemia COVID-19. Hugo Gómez, Tribunal de Justicia de la Comunidad Andina, Perú. Maximiliano Santa Cruz, Cruz IP, Chile. José Manuel Otero Lastres, Proceta Abogados, España. Moderador, Marcos Mercado, Guevara y Gutiérrez, Bolivia.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. It is a true honor and a privilege to be moderating this panel today. I want to thank the Executive Committee of SCB for inviting me, and I want to congratulate you because our dear association is doing its best to organize events and webinars at all times, to have clubs, to have podcasts, and so many other activities that allow for keeping our members active and together. So once again, thank you and congratulations for your work. Today we have top of the line speakers. They are experts in the areas of patents and intellectual property. So it is a pleasure to have you here. I want to thank all three of you for accepting our invitation to be here today. And today you're going to be talking about a topic that is current. Everyone is talking about it, and it's even polemic, which are compulsory patent licenses in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that humanity is undergoing a pandemic that we had never undergone before. The world population is looking towards finding solutions, and sometimes those solutions seem to go hand in hand with vaccination. Governments are doing their best to provide their citizens with vaccines to get the herd immunity that everyone wants to get to contain the virus and try to find a way towards a certain level of normality in our lives. Unfortunately, throughout the world, the access to vaccines is different depending on whether we live in developed or underdevelopment countries. And these differences are more and more latent. We do know that there are multiple initiatives. I think the most concrete is the one that the WHO is dealing with, an organization that has tried to provide different extensions in order to prevent, contain, and treat COVID-19. There are multiple countries that have joined that initiative, and I believe that this organization has taken these proposals and initiatives and has asked for a meeting of the Executive Committee that will take place on June the 9th. We also know that President Biden, the President of the United States, has indicated the support of their administration to waive the property rights for COVID vaccines. And through that measure, the Biden administration is trying to favor less developed countries, allowing them to access information with regards to how vaccines are being produced. But that does not seem to be a concrete proposal or measure. It appears to be a political measure rather than a policy per se. The European Union has also indicated its interest in this aspect. There are certain countries and member states that are in favor of doing this, while others are not. And in the meantime, pharma companies that develop vaccines are looking at these proposals with concern because they believe that they are not beneficial for the industry. Without a shadow of a doubt, we are all thankful with these pharma companies that have done their best and have worked hard to very quickly produce these necessary vaccines. So I think now it is the turn of our dear speakers to talk more about this topic, which is extremely delicate, and to discuss the delicate debate between the access to public health and the respect for property rights. This is a forum is specifically targeting copyrights and intellectual property rights. And this is definitely a great field for discussion. So I want to present our first speaker. It's the Council Maximiliano Santa Cruz. He is Chilean. Maximiliano has led the National IP Institute of Chile, and he was the president of that institute until 2018. In the last years, that organization has been elected 3 times as the best government organization in Chile and was selected 2 times as the most innovative access organization at the global level. He also participated in the World Committee of Patents at the heart of the WIPO. He was also a negotiator for Chile of the free trade agreement with the U.S., and he negotiated the chapters of intellectual property in the main business and trade agreements with the European Union and Korea, among other countries. He is also a panelist of multiple technology companies. He is a consultant for the IDB and participates in the intellectual property, the EPO, and in other organizations. He is a lawyer, and he has an LLM from the University of San Francisco from California in the United States. My dear Max, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes to conduct your presentation. And please, all speakers, remember to keep your mics off. And thank you again for joining us.
Muy bien.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Marcos, for presenting me. I want to give a warm welcome to all attendees and also to José Manuel and Hugo, my co-panelists. And I want to thank all the authorities of SCP for inviting me here today. It is an honor to be here as a private citizen and not as a government official. So I think that the discussion for today is one of the most current and most important political discussions in the world. And I think that this is a timely panel. And I want to remind everyone that yesterday, the World Health Assembly was launched in the WHO. This is an annual assembly of the WHO. And it is very likely that in a few days, we will continue hearing more about new developments and changes in this pandemic and in the field of intellectual property, because this discussion is also being discussed in the World Trade Organization too. And they are getting together in several meetings to analyze the waiver proposed by India and South Africa. So when I was invited to participate in this panel, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to keep track of my time. I'm putting on a timer. So as I was saying, when I was invited to this panel, I thought that perhaps my perspective might be rather different from the perspective of many other people who work in the field of intellectual property. And my perspective might be a bit new or a bit disruptive for some. But I do want to start by telling all of you that just as Marcos was mentioning about my experience, I firmly believe in intellectual property because I understand that intellectual property is one of the most efficient tools for the promotion of innovation and creativity, but also the spreading of information and technological transfers. And I think that has been the guiding light in my career. I worked at the international level for over 10 years in multiple countries. I was also the director of the IP national office in Chile, and I've always found that balance is fundamental. And so I am sensitive to this topic and this issue, and I naturally have an opinion, albeit I am not inflexible with regards to intellectual property. I am very flexible, and many of the things that I am saying are opinions and not principles. But I firmly believe in intellectual property, and I understand that intellectual property does not only seek the goal of protecting and registering, that is, of dealing with the most private dimension of IP, but also I believe in the public dimension that has to do with sharing and transferring knowledge and technology. And I think that that's at the heart of our system. From the 19th century, with the two intellectual property treaties that are part of who we are. And I do understand that this declaration of having two sides of the same coin are also incorporated in our principles in Articles 7 and 8. And we've had this discussion first at the core of the GATT, and then for the TRIPS. Remember that by 1994, many countries were not even granting patent protections for pharma, but even multiple developed countries had still not incorporated protection for pharma and food products. So this is something that is relatively new for many, and it is very likely one of the topics that created the most impact and revolutionized the international intellectual property system for everyone, I would say. Now, once the pandemic struck, I think a series of events was unleashed that I think put the capacity of the multilateral and international intellectual property system to the test with regards to how we face the situation. This is a dramatic situation. Marcos presented several examples of why this is a drama for many. But the reality is that today, over 160 million people have caught the disease. We, I think, have gotten close to 3.5 million people who are deceased. Less than 1% of people in medium and low income countries have been vaccinated, which is not the case of Chile, but I do understand that this cannot stand. It cannot be that we have so few vaccines in the country and across the world even. And the world needs so many vaccines for 70% of the target population across the world, but very, very few vaccines have been produced. So they don't cover all the doses that are necessary. So we are facing a situation where production is insufficient and distribution is not equitable. By the beginning of the pandemic, mechanisms were created. For example, in Costa Rica. And these mechanisms have not been used either by countries or providers who distribute vaccines. I'm talking about the pools where intellectual property could be shared. So it is true that the market is not meeting the demand. It's not meeting the issues. And so it's not strange that other measures have been taken to deal with this. Within the measures that we've heard of as people who work within the field of IP are measures that were produced by developed countries to make their mechanisms to adopt and allow for more flexible licenses. And we've seen that in multiple countries, such as the case of Canada, in order to use these compulsory patent licenses or not. Israel actually emitted its first compulsory patent license immediately for technologies that had something to do with COVID. So We know from the facts, and this is something that Marcos also mentioned, one of the most important things that happened was the proposal of having a waiver. At the core of the World Trade Organization in the Trade Council. And many of us heard of this thanks to the decision made by the Biden-Harris administration a couple of weeks ago to support this measure, which, as was also mentioned earlier, has been supported by over 100 countries, has been sponsored by 62 members of the WTO, which led the U.S. administration to decide to support this waiver. Now, the thing is that this is a demand that is not just coming from countries, because the President Biden said that over 40 presidents had reached out to him to ask for help with vaccines, but he also mentioned that civil society organizations, that 165 world leaders, including Nobel Prize winners, and presidents such as President Lagos from my country, the Helen Card, the Mikhail Gorbachev, and several other leaders and prominent figures have called for this because the situation is dramatic. Now, however, this waiver presented by South Africa and India is nothing but a temporary measure. It is a measure that would only be applied in the pandemic. So we are expecting to see how much time would be defined for this waiver. And only a couple of days ago, it was defined through a proposal for the waiver for this to be carried out in the next 3 years. And this is something that the WTO Council might be able to revise.
So this is a temporary proposal, exceptional proposal. It is a proposal that wouldn't include only vaccines, but it would also include technology in general. That is to say, it could include vaccines, but also any other type of technology, as from protective equipment, medicines in general, surgical methods. It's quite wide in its range, but we know that could be revised for 3 years. And I think that Marco also mentioned that the European Union is showing some interest in this, is supporting this idea. At first, there were many countries that opposed this idea: Canada, Switzerland, Australia. And remember, the European Union is part of the WTO. Italy, France, Spain, they are not part of the WTO. So there have been some developments also after the support of the states. And a few days ago, the European Parliament issued a resolution that, although it was related to HIV, makes a call to provide support to the waiver. And it also makes a call upon the industry to share their technology, intellectual property in this mechanism that was proposed from this region and supported by many, many countries. So there is a mechanism to share data, technology, intellectual property, technology transfer, etc. Something else is that Bolivia also, some days ago, Bolivia, no more than a week ago, activated a mechanism for the new 31 base article that states that allows the export and import of medicines for those countries that do not have the capacity to manufacture them, to produce them. So this was created in 2017. And then once it was approved by the WTO, and after the protocol of the August the 30th, 2005, it was approved. So now here we have a call by one country, a country in our region, and I think that Bolivia is asking for 15 million doses. That would be enough for its population. Now, when it comes to the waiver, I believe it's clear that the waiver is not the solution to the pandemic or to the inequality in vaccine distribution. It is not the solution. It is simply a measure. I wouldn't say it's just a political measure. I don't think it is. The waiver, even though it does not solve all the problems, it do have some legal consequences, legal effects, and that refers to some political mechanisms that can be established through the countries. However, if a country wants to apply a waiver, they will have to modify their legislation. So it's highly probable that legislation in the different countries of our countries, they probably have legal barriers and constitutional barriers to use this resource and make use of intellectual property. So they will have to implement new legislation to make those changes required, or executive orders required to this. It is not a solution by itself. It do have legal consequences, and of course that it has a huge political effect. Here in my country, there are many people working on this, and measures are being taken about it. It is clear that a waiver for patents and other medical technologies for COVID won't solve the problem. We do have problems in technological transfer, sharing know-how, lack of products, management of intellectual property. We also need new technologies and many, many other things. What's important and interesting, and I have read some statements by people in my country and also abroad, and what they say is that this waiver does not solve the problem because we are lacking all the other aspects that I mentioned. But at the same time, they say that we do have the mechanisms today. We all know that a mandatory license does one thing, that is to exempt you to comply with the rights of a patent law. So it won't provide technology transfer or know-how or products or medical technologies that are required and needed. So I think it's not sensible to say that paying attention to all the things that we lack instead of thinking about what to do to overcome this situation. I told you that the waiver was not the solution for this, and it's probably a condition, but not the only one. And it does help, of course. It's not the only solution available. It is clear there's an idea that intellectual property is not a barrier to find a solution and for others to produce medicines and drugs. And that is true. But what we are aiming at with a waiver is trying to say that intellectual property can help to increase production and also to increase equality. And for that, we need volunteer licenses.
Lo que pasó ayer, les dije, acabo de...
What happened yesterday is the assembly of the World Health Organization was open and they issued a report. I think that was yesterday or some days ago. There was an independent panel, and this mechanism was created by the WHO to think about this. And one of the 6 urgent calls that the panel made to try to stop the pandemic, I think I have 2 minutes left was to urge the WHO to gather all the vaccine manufacturers and medical technologies with other manufacturers to promote licensing and increase production and distribution of vaccines. I think that is sensible. I think the solution is around those ideas. Again, the mandatory license is not enough and the waiver is not enough. We need to have more vaccines and we need to have more licensing. Just to round it up, I would like to say that my option could be obviously to have a voluntary license. Till last year, I was lucky enough to participate in the medicine patent pool. Some of you probably know about this. This was a mechanism created in unity. There was an organization created by some countries. It was created by Blair, Chirac, Lula, Lagos, and they created unity to promote and fund research and development in connection to some diseases, hepatitis C, malaria, TB. And what Unity did was to create a medicine license pool. It's an organization in Switzerland. And what they do, they basically negotiate with innovative medicines manufacturers. I also took part helping them with the license. I was leading the expert group. And the medicine patent pool, what they do during those 10 years, they negotiated licenses from 10 licensees, Trajandon, Pfizer, Farco, Roche, many other companies. And we got licenses for 13 antiretrovirals, HIV, and the model was turned so successful for manufacturers, and now they can reach places that it was impossible for them to reach in the past. And now generic drugs also have licenses and they work directly with the government. So this is a win-win situation for everybody, governments, manufacturers, and patients. They expanded the model to TB and hepatitis. And after that, that was included for all the fundamental medicines in the WHO. So I think this is the kind of mechanisms that we need to explore. So the panel is asking to have more licensing, and we need to include innovators and generic drugs manufacturers because they do have the experience in licensing. So thank you very much for having me. Maximiliano, thank you very much. Your presentation was very clear. So what you said was true, and that's right. Now we're going to be sharing some of the questions through the ACP platform. So Max, thank you very much. Now let me introduce you to José Manuel Otero Lastres, that he's in Madrid, in Spain. He's a doctor in law at the University of Santiago de Compostela. He's a professor in the University of the León and University. He's been the dean of the University of the León between 1981 and 85. Professor Otero is an expert in topics related to advertising, trademarks, industrial design, among other topics. He is a speaker and a lecturer in different conferences in the world. He has written several books and more than 90 papers in several journals in Spain and different countries, and also in different languages. Apart from his experience as a lawyer. He has also published 2 novels, 3 storybooks, and he also writes in different newspapers in Spain. He's also a member of the executive board of Real Madrid football team, and it's an honor to have you today, Professor. Now you have the floor. Okay, thank you. As Maximiliano was saying, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because this is a panel that behaves exactly as the pandemic. It's all over the world. So the first thing is to greet those that are connected. Secondly, I would like to express, to let you know how happy I am of being part of this panel with all these top-of-the-line speakers. Maximiliano's CV, it's amazing, and Hugo's the same. So it's a pleasure for me to be part of this panel today. I would like to thank ACP for having me today. And I would also like to thank Marcos for his presentation, for his introduction. So just let me tell you that I have written 5 novels. So the 4th and the 5th novels are related to Latin America. The 4th takes place in Cartagena de Indias, and my 5th novel takes place in the House of Jade in Guatemala.
And it connects to this world that I love so much, not just at the professional level, but at the literary level as well. But anyway, without further ado, I do want to go into the topic, and I think Maximiliano did a wonderful job of contextualizing this. We are undergoing a great world crisis, perhaps as we've never seen before, that not only has an impact on health, and the data that he shared is the same data that I have. We're talking about 3,400,000 people who have passed away, and 167 million citizens across the world who have caught the disease. So the health situation is dire. But it is also having an extraordinary impact on the global economy, because the figures that we have now is that the world losses at the economy level are of $375 billion a day. And that is a spooky figure for sure. So we need to solve this financial crisis. We need to solve this health crisis. And we need to solve both of them because they're both weighing down on us. And I want to start by saying that when at the beginning of March in Spain, we started hearing about COVID and COVID-19 and coronavirus, I, who work in industrial property and patents, felt strange and kind of odd about the fact that I wasn't hearing anything about patents. The world of patents was under the radar until a very few months ago. I think perhaps it's because no vaccines were in sight. And once those vaccines were developed and obtained, the matter has been crystallized that patents produce exclusive and excluding effects, and that the owner of those patents can forbid others from selling those patents and distribute their content. But the issue that has been brought to the table is indirectly connected to patents, because given this growing need for vaccines across the world, and as Maximiliano was saying, 2 very significant problems have taken place. One has to do with a lack of production and manufacturing, and then a big problem of inadequate distribution, because although the vaccine has been brought about in a very short time, because vaccines take about 4 to 5 years to be produced, and this only took 1 year and a half, because the entire pharma industry has been doing research on the vaccines, and we were able to get a vaccine in record times. But even if we did it in record time, and given the situation in which we are, all answers are not satisfactory because we're not covering the demand. So I do think that we need to bear in mind what are the issues that we have to then discuss how we can solve them. And so we have vaccines for which there are patents, and they are insufficient and poorly distributed. And apart from that, they have a component that relates to the GDP of countries. Countries that have a high GDP get many vaccines. The demand for vaccines is relatively satisfied, while countries that have a much lower GDP can find a scarce number of vaccines to meet the demand of their citizens. And that introduces this element of injustice, because there are some countries that can vaccinate their citizens, and then there are countries that are running into multiple objects to vaccinate their citizens. But because this matter can lead to speculation, rather populist speculations, or rather sentimental or emotive speculations and comments, I think we should not lose sight of what the issue is so we can solve it. And the problem indirectly connects to patents, but it is not fully directly related to patents. And let me explain why I say this. Up until now, Maximiliano was perfectly discussing something that we could call exogenous measures that are outside of patent law to solve the issue of distribution and insufficiency. They are external because they're not provided by patent law, and they have to do with stopping the patent from having its effects either in a definite or provisional way. We're talking about revoking the effects of patents, or in the way that people who are not experts might say, it's about freeing patents. And yes, these measures are okay, but I hardly believe that these measures might solve the problem. And what I would ask are two things. First is, if we revoke these patents, would the immediate effect produced be an increase in the production of vaccines, and would that necessarily lead to a proper distribution? Well, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid not, because in truth, theoretically, there's a possibility that if we suspend the effects and revoke the effects of patents, that we might be finding more people who can produce and distribute these vaccines. But the question is, what are the infrastructures available right now to actually deal with the enormous demand for vaccines that the world is calling for? So I am afraid that there is no direct causality. Revoking the effects of a patent, even in a provisional way, will not necessarily lead to vaccines being efficiently produced in the market. That's one thing. And then the second thing, and this highly concerns me, is what are the effects for the patent system if at this stage, where we are in the most urgent situations, the first measure that we go for is revoking patents? What happens in the future then? Who is going to be in charge of saying that this won't happen again, if we know that from the get-go, if we find issues with distribution and production, then the effects of patents are revoked? I think we need to ask ourselves this, because if we go against the basis of the patent systems in a very unnecessary way, and I say unnecessary because this is not the solution, it is not waiver production and distribution, this is not the best solution. So I think, and I go back to Maximiliano and I coincide with you, that these are good proposals, that these are solidary proposals. I wouldn't say that these are political proposals, albeit there are political reasons here, because at the heart of being a politician, it's this need to get votes. So, and if the citizens are asking for vaccines and you promise vaccines for them, they will vote for you. But I don't want to think about that. I want to think about patents. And economists are and have been against the patent system, and we have concluded that the patent system is the best system if we exclude all others, as it just so happens with democracy. So I would move away from external remedies and think about internal remedies, the remedies that we find within patent law. And basically for that, we have two possible remedies. One is moving into the idea of a negotiated agreement between the owner of the patent and third parties that might increase the production and increase the distribution. Or we might move away from the world of agreements and then think about radical measures such as expropriation or compulsory licenses. And I do coincide with Maximiliano in that I don't believe that compulsory patent licenses are not the best way to go, and expropriation are definitely not the way to go, because as Maximiliano was saying, is that next to the essential technical rule of the patent, there are multiple aspects of knowledge that one does not share. And if I am forced to enter into an agreement with someone in a situation that is not beneficial for me, I won't divulge the information. I won't be solidary because I cannot be forced to give something out that I don't want to give out. So I think that the best solution is the conventional solution, which is making sure that the owners of these patent licenses to understand and be convinced that we are facing a critical situation. And it is true that it is critical, because only a year and a half ago has undergone. But the problem in many countries has already been solved, as is the case of Israel. So in very short time, we find that it's logical for issues to exist in distribution and in production, but this is still urgent. So we do need to foster the entering into agreements between the owners of the patents and other production units that are ready and might be very quickly turned into producers of these vaccines, because the demand is high, and the demand will be temporary, because once the pandemic is gone, everything will be readjusted again. Now, I would dare go even further in this discussion, and I would dare, because I think that on the one hand, we should have patent regulations be more flexible in two ways. First, because we need to manage to get companies to try to sell at their without any gain, because we know that they have gotten public funding for the production of those vaccines, because governments have said, okay, I am paying you in anticipation, and with the money that I give you, you can fund your research and produce a vaccine. So it would be good for them to sell at cost price. And then the second place, and I do understand that not everyone might be in agreement with me, for there to be a benefit for these companies, but for the benefit to be very moderate. Because I don't know what's going on in your country, but in Spain, regulations for good corporate governance are being dictated, that are requesting for companies to be solidary. And today it is impossible to run away from this, because this is a world that is globalized, and it's impossible for companies who have a legitimate right to benefit from what they get and from what they produce, but to abuse that benefit by gaining from the pain of humanity. So I think we should also limit those benefits. And this is not about attacking the patent system. I think this is about a moderate attack for the part of the trading of the content. In the trading phase, the effects of the patent, of course, might have an influence on the input at the output of a product, right? But because the demand is so high, they might lower prices and still gain marginal benefits. And that's where we can act. Because we need to remember that this is a globalized world and everyone is connected. The market is practically global and international, and solidarity must be the guiding light. The solidarity to assist those that have less than us, because it is not just inconvenient to live in a country that is poor and for you to be poor, but also for you to suffer the grave consequences of a disease because you live in that poor country. And the last thing, and with this I want to wrap up. I think I'm doing good on time, but still I want to wrap up. Is that I wouldn't like for the patent system to be under attack because it is a sensitive system. You know that the rights and the patent rights are essential for free trade in market economies. Everyone has a role, and patents are the best incentive to do research and to invest in research. And if we attack patents in such a critical time, I am afraid we will not have a response that we want, and we won't have all the vaccines that we need because no one would be willing to risk money so that we might then waive the effects of a patent. Nothing more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We share most of the things that you have mentioned. We may have a debate after that. So thank you very much for your presentation and congratulations on your presentation. So our next speaker, Hugo Gómez Apac from Peru. He's justice in Peru, and he's a university professor in several universities. He teaches in the master's degree course of intellectual property in the Pontificia, in the master degree of administrative degree, and also the University of the Pacifico in the master's in San Gregorio de Puerto Viejo, and the School of Law. Dr. Gómez is a speaker and a lecturer in several events, not only related to intellectual property, but also to other topics. Hugo Gómez has also chaired the Justice Board of the Indian community. Thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours, and you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you very much, Marcos. I would like to thank CP, to the Executive Board, for having me, and I would also like to thank my colleagues, José Manuel and Maximiliano, that have made excellent presentations. So I would like to explain a little bit about the Justice Board of the Indian community issued in March about mandatory licensing. What José Manuel has mentioned, and Maximiliano as well, what we see today is a conflict between private interest of the owner of the patent and public interest of the population to have access to the vaccines. So private interest, that is the owner of the patent, should be coordinated with the public interest. We have a conflict between these two forces, and of course that the public interest is more important. That applies to patents and to all the fields of law. we need to accept that there are some exceptional circumstances in which the rights of the owner of the patent can be limited because of the public interest. And to Article 31 states that the countries can use the patents without the authorization of the owner of the patents in the case of urgent matters. In paragraph number 4 in the Doha Declaration states that the agreement should not prevent state members of the WHO to take measures to protect public health. So that agreement should be interpreted in a way that provides support to the power of the governments to protect public health and to promote access to drugs for everyone. So that is a way of making access easier for the population, and that should be done through this mandatory licensing, the topic we are discussing today. Through a mandatory license, the government authorizes a third party to exploit those rights without the authorization of the owner of the patent. And the use of that mandatory license may allow to manufacture vaccines in greater numbers. And then the state can provide vaccines to the population with fewer resources. But as Maximiliano mentioned, to manufacture vaccines and medicines, the patent is not enough. You also need the technology required to manufacture them, manufacturing methods. So there's no point in having a mandatory license if you lack the technology to manufacture that product. And even worse, if you don't have the infrastructure or the input required to manufacture the vaccines. On Chapter 7, Title 2 of the Decision 486 of the Andean Community that works about intellectual property for Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, regulates 4 types of mandatory licenses of patents. When the patent is not exploited, if there are public interest reasons or national urgency, because there are behaviors that go against the market, that is Article 66, or when the holder, the owner of the patent, requires another patent, and that is Article 67. The interpretation 144 of March 16th this year, the Tribunal of the Andean Community has defined some interpretations of the content and the reach of Article 65 of 486 decision, and this regulates the mandatory licenses due to public interest or national urgency. The first criteria for this interpretation developed by the Andean Board is that the reason for the public interest, that is the genus, and then there are different species and other reasons for that. Among those are the reasons for public interest. The Andean Court has mentioned the protection of the environment, the need for the population to have access to medicines and drugs. So it's not only those 3 reasons in Article 65 of Decision 486. It's only one reason, and that is because of the public interest. Then we have different modalities. So the Andean Court has differentiated the need for the population to have access to medicines, medical equipment, or vaccines. That is one reason. Of emergency, a health emergency, that is another situation. With the pandemic of COVID-19, we have a health emergency, and that justifies the mandatory license, that we have patents already issued, but you don't need to get to that extreme to authorize a mandatory license. The only thing that you need is if the population has a need to access medicines, as it happens, for instance, for retrovirals for HIV. A second criteria to interpret all this is about the fact that a mandatory license requires the government to explain very clearly and on a case-by-case basis why they need to adopt such a measure, so that it can be fully justified to give the possibility to a third party of exploit a patent without the authorization of the owner. And that is directly related to the time in which those reasons are still applicable. So it's not enough for the authority to justify the public interest, but they also need to take into account the specific features of each case, and they need to explain the circumstances, for example, in the case of an emergency, or if national security is at risk. And in the same way, they need to explain the reasons to justify that before those circumstances, it is fundamental to then have a mandatory license. As any other government measure that goes against some rights, they need to comply with some requirements. It should be necessary and it should be proportional. As an example, if you're talking about a vaccine, the mandatory license should be the best option to fulfill the objective of protecting the population's health. There shouldn't be any other measure that can do the same thing. And the implementation of the measure should have more benefits, more advantages than disadvantages. When it comes to the need, if there is, for example, there's another measure that can, as is being said in Peru, they can purchase the vaccines and the medicines for the population in public hospitals. If all these measures are not possible, are not feasible, then it could be justified then to have a mandatory license so that a third party can manufacture those vaccines. So if there are other measures that can be implemented that are also effective to protect the health of the population, then they should be implemented. If there are no such measures, then you should go for a mandatory license. Now, if we have a question, if the reason for the public interest or any other reason can be declared by the executive branch, can be declared only case by case, on a case-by-case basis to justify having a mandatory license, the Andean court said that a mandatory license due to public interest should be analyzed case by case. And in that case, you need to justify those reasons, as I told you. A third criterion for this interpretation that was developed by the Andean court has to do with the effects of having a mandatory license. They have mentioned that if the owner of the patent, in that case, the resource that they will have to use is not effective. So the legal effects of the mandatory license are continue in time. So having a mandatory license is an administrative action. So it is important to mention that this rule that consists when the act is challenged, the act of having a mandatory license is challenged, then it can be applied to all the four modes of mandatory licensing for patents included in that decision. In the case of the mandatory license in Article 65, due to national interest, this rule that I mentioned is part of it because this license shows the public interest. As fourth criterion for the interpretation, the Andean court says that regarding the different four modes of mandatory license included in Decision 486, the holder of the patent keeps the right to have economic compensation and they keep their rights to exploit the patent. And that is so because a mandatory license does not seize the rights of the owner. So they keep the rights to continue to exploit the patent and having an economic compensation for the mandatory licensing. This should be reasonable and fair and should take into account the situation and context of each case. Luis Enriquez, when he invited me to be part of this panel, he asked me to explain a little bit the content of this decision implemented by the court in March. However, I am aware that this debate could go beyond this interpretation. And now, after Maximiliano and José Manuel's presentation, they told us about the great concern at global level about the need to manufacture more vaccines. So demand is higher, the greater than supply. So now we have scarcity of vaccines. We're talking about 167 million people infected, millions of people that died. So we're talking about billions of people in underdeveloped countries that have no access to vaccines. What can we do about that? So the Justice Tribunal in the Andean community, they interpret about current situations. They do not do that for the future. So these thoughts are just personal thoughts, just to comment on what we have been discussing. Probably you have heard about the book and the Black Swan. In the epilogue of this book, there's a very interesting part about the things that we can learn from Mother Nature, the oldest and the wisest. Mother Nature likes redundancy, and one of them is a defensive redundancy. Imagine as if it were an insurance policy, taught us and gave us more organs than those that we need. We have 2 kidneys, 2 testicles, 2 eyes, and of course that we can live only with one of them. In some cases, one of these organs develops more ability of what you normally use.
So Tuolab says redundancy is like an insurance policy, and apparent inefficiencies are related to maintenance costs for these spare parts that have the necessary energy to keep them active regardless of their apparent uselessness. And if it were for economists, we would only have 1 lung or 1 kidney because it's inefficient to have 2. It's better to have 1. Evidently and happily, nature does not think like an economist, because the wisdom of Mother Nature is that we live in a world of dangers. Nature is dangerous, and the adaptation of our bodies responds to that danger. The attack of a ferocious animal might lead us to losing a kidney or an eye, but we might survive because we have another one. So nature thinks about the worst case scenario and adapts us for that. So let us follow the advice of Mother Nature. This will not be the last pandemic. We might have new pandemics that are even more contagious and more lethal. So all the different scenarios that we find today need to consider what will happen in the future. So what kind of patent rules and systems do we need now to face even more catastrophes in the next 3, 5, or 10 years? So how do we prepare ourselves better today for what might come tomorrow? How can we help companies perhaps to continue investing in research and in innovation, or by removing the rights that they have to their patents? It's a difficult question. So, if nature likes redundancy, let us be redundant in our search for solutions. Let us look for how to create more vaccines without losing incentives in research and innovation. More developed countries that have sufficient vaccines should support countries that are in development by providing more vaccines. And the reason for that is simple. Every person who is vaccinated in the world is a positive externality. We live in a globalized, interconnected world. So, as it just so happens with global warming, what happens in one country has consequences in other countries, regardless of how remote they are. So developed countries need to understand that spending money in vaccines for countries that are in development is an investment, because the more people are vaccinated, the traffic and circulation of people across the world stops being a problem that interferes with social and economic traffic. So this is not a public-private dichotomy. We're talking about both sectors having to participate in public-private associations, investing in public-private enterprises. We need more investment to improve public health, and for that we need public-private funding, and we need that too in order to create vaccines. If we have a public-private association, we have less risk. We have 2 eyes, 2 kidneys, and we have 2 sectors. We have the private sector and the public sector. We have 2 kinds of countries, those that are developed and those that are in transition. So if we want to work today to deal with pandemics that might be even more ferocious in the future, we need to gamble on redundancy, and that means working together in cooperation within the private and the public sector, finding a way to articulate in a solidary way the work of developed and in transition countries. And that might mean that we need to spend a bit more now, and that doesn't matter because nature has taught us that sometimes the best thing we can do to face adversity is to be redundancy. And in current times, redundancy is not just protecting ourselves, but also protecting others. It's about being solidary. Thank you, Mario. I hope I nailed the time. Yes, Dr. Hugo Gómez. Thank you. That was excellent. Your presentation was really clear. I think the common denominator for all 3 presentations is that the intellectual property system should not be attacked, patents should not be seized or expropriated. It is not advisable to issue compulsory licenses without prior negotiation and without assessing the risk of doing this for the future. And I do want to ask you, in your knowledge, if you have tried negotiating the possibility of issuing licenses with the companies that develop these vaccines. Do you have any knowledge of whether or not countries have attempted to issue these kinds of licenses? Okay, I'll answer. What I know with regards to contractual licenses is that, except for the case of the Andean Tribunal, which was not the case of a license for a vaccine patent, but for another pharma product, but that actually hits the nail on the head, because at the time where this matter of compulsory licenses was being discussed, they did an amazing interpretation for the entire regulation on compulsory patents. But I do not think that that's the way to go. I think we need to explore the road of contractual licenses. But there are other things that we might discuss. There are those who say that there are certain restrictions for certain countries to get the basic materials and raw materials that they need in order to produce the vaccines. And I think that, as Hugo was mentioning at the end of this, that if this is a global pandemic, we need a global response. And as the COVAX mentioned, the way for all of us to save each other is for no one to be left unvaccinated. The key is for everyone to be vaccinated, because this virus is mutating and there are vaccines that might become obsolete if we don't have a proper response. So far, the vaccines that we have seem to be sufficient to cover the multiple mutations of coronavirus. But I do believe that not that much time has gone by, and although we have detected that there is a lack of sufficient manufacturing and we do have inadequate distribution and there are measures for that, I don't think that those measures have actually reached pharma communities. And we haven't gotten all the way to the world of the contractual licensing, even if all the characters in this particular drama seem to be looking for agreements.
Excelente.
Excellent. Thank you. Any more comments, Max? Yes. I understand that pharma companies and patent owners have granted licenses to factories, and they have increased production capacity for sure, but that has not been enough. I mean, clearly it's not enough. But what both my co-panelists mentioned, especially José Manuel, I think that it is not a good solution for us to have a waive or a compulsory license. But as President Biden said when he supported the waiver, or better said, when the USDR said it, extraordinary situations call for exceptional or extraordinary measures. So here, I think about 90% of the innovation in vaccinations has been achieved through public funding. Also, and I think José Manuel also mentioned this, anticipated purchases were also a plus for innovation because the United States did that in great amounts. Chile also spent significant amounts of money buying practically from all producers of vaccines. And third, most of these vaccines use public technologies. And we know that the case of Moderna actually uses patents that are public. So I do want to ask us to not think that whether we take exceptional roads, as any country in the world might be able to use. And if we think about the US, they always use compulsive licenses. And because of that, they have been able to create great things. That might not be the case for everyone, particularly in countries with economies in transition. Public funding is high, and most of the innovation is produced because of public funding. So I do trust that we're not going to get to a situation where the waiver leads for patents not to be respected. I think there will be measures put in place. And I think that the way to go is for us to have voluntary licensing. And around this topic, which my fellow panelists mentioned, where neither a waiver nor a compulsory license are enough to produce a vaccine, I think a voluntary license would most definitely solve all the issues. Big pharma companies do this all the time. And I do understand that one of the ex-heads of the chemical department of Moderna said that in 3 or 4 months, it could be possible to set up a plant to manufacture the Moderna vaccine. So it's a matter of will. I think that there are opposite interests between what the industry and the general economy want, even what the Chamber of Commerce of many countries, big countries, want, have decided to say that this is bad for global economies, not so much for vaccine manufacturers. Because what happens is if we're not vaccinated, we will, of course, have new strains, and we will need more boosters to vaccinate the population. So they would benefit from it, but not everyone would. So given those things, this is an exceptional situation that calls for exceptional measures and for a new way of thinking. And you mentioned a book, and I was thinking of another book called How to Save Capitalism from Capitalists. And if we who work in IP don't think about a way that goes right to the heart of intellectual property, that it was created for certain objectives, but that there are always cases where we need a balance and this equilibrium between the owner and the access, we will kill the tool, because the tool works and it works well. And because of the tool of intellectual property, we can get vaccines in a year. But if we don't understand what is happening today, we don't understand how dire this is, then no one will benefit from it.
Gracias.
Thank you. I have a question from Roberto Herrera from Colombia. I would like for you to talk a bit more about the examples, because you said that having free or waived patents would not be useful because there would still be trade secrets that would stop vaccines from being produced. Is that so? Okay, if I may, I think this is why we're talking about having voluntary licensing and negotiations, because they lead to this. Practically all big pharma companies willingly negotiate licensing agreements. Another road which is more transparent, which is based on public health reasons, is the road of having contracts where not only is a patent licensed, but it also has to do with how you produce, manufacture, export, offer for sale. The patent, they are technological transfer contracts, and they also have to do with technological transfer. So if you infringe on the patent, you're going to be missing on many things. For example, the safety and efficacy tests for these drugs. Without those tests, no drugs, either generic or innovative, might be sold. And many of those things also have market exclusivity and are trade secrets. In the Chilean case, actually, when the non-disclosed information protection ruling was introduced, we said, okay, if someone creates a compulsory license, what we will do is have a mirror disposition for non-disclosed information, so that one can also disclose the testings on safety and efficacy because they're confidential. So I think you need much more than a patent to produce a drug or a vaccine. So I think the way to go is a voluntary license road. But once again, like I mentioned, there are countries that have the skills necessary to disclose that information. And for that, we need public funding, of course. Okay, thank you. There's a comment over here from Mauricio Elia from Brazil. He says, in Brazil, there was a very significant decision made by the Federal Supreme Court that deleted paragraph 1st of the Article 40 of the Intellectual Property Law, and it has had an effect ex nunc for patents. So that means that certain countries are now taking measures to either deal with this issue or overcome it. And this is an issue that has to do with patents that at times have not necessarily been around for so long.
I would like to ask you a question. Do you know whether manufacturing of the components for the patents is enough? Or that may be just another issue together with the specific issue of compulsory licenses. I know it's a sensitive topic, right? Yeah, in a document that I read by G20, the G20 is a group that we need to pay attention to. They were saying that it would be useful that the US basically provide free access to raw materials. There were some restrictions to some raw materials required. So if you control that, then you are controlling all the manufacturing of vaccines. So it's not anything that I invented, or it's basically the G20 speaking. That is a global agency that is very powerful. I think it is crucial that we have a global perspective to this issue. It is true that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. There's no doubt about that. But the thing is, which are the right exceptional measures to be taken? what really concerns me the most is that we don't take any measure that has the effect that we are looking for. Because in the event of a new pandemic that may happen in the future, as Emiliano was saying, in that case, we need to acknowledge the response of the pharma world that only in a year and a half provided the right answer. And it's also true that they started working many years ago, but still, I think that the process was very quick. And also public administration. So as you mentioned, there was great coordination between the private and the public sector that resulted in an appropriate response and the right number of vaccines so that humankind can start finding a way out of the pandemic. So I think that I'm too old, but I think that we need to be careful with patents. Marco, just one comment. And I would like to make some personal comments. As I told you, the tribunal makes statements about ongoing regulations. As a personal comment, and connected to what José Manuel is saying, what you do today will have an impact in the future. So you need to know that the measures taken today will have a consequence in the future, and some aspects that will encourage or discourage some other events in the future. Why? Because people are like that, businesses and companies behave like that, and governments behave like that. So if we have to choose, you need to know how companies behave when they are punished or how they behave when they are encouraged. So what you decide today will have an impact on the future. And we need to know that in the future, the pandemics may be even worse. So it's so far, the manufacturing of vaccines has been successful thanks to the mutual coordination between the private sector and the support of the public sector. The idea is, and the question is, why would we change this? So maybe we need to continue just like this, and now we don't need to create new vaccines, but to manufacture more vaccines. So I think that we need to think of a scenario in which we need to manufacture more vaccines, taking into account public and private coordination. So let's continue what we have been doing so far, but now focusing on the manufacturing of more vaccines. Yeah, obviously this topic does not revolve around vaccines only. Transportation is important. So how you transport all the vaccines or each vial, or try to find different ways of transporting those vaccines so that countries that cannot manufacture them can work on the packaging of those vaccines, on the containers. So there are different ways in which we can approach this pandemic. No, and also connected to what you were saying, I think that Pfizer vaccine needs to be stored in very low temperatures. So that kind of transportation is not very easy to implement. Not everybody can have access to that. From the regulation standpoint, I believe there may be some difficulties because we only focus on compulsory licenses, because according to the Indian court, that allows only to waive the license after 3 years. So we haven't had 3 years yet. So what about legislation in the other countries? When it comes to compulsory licenses, because at least here we would have those licenses, that limitation. I think that we all believe that the best way is try to achieve an agreement between the public and private sectors, between governments, manufacturers, or developing countries to try to find licenses. I would like to have some concluding statements by you. Thank you.
Maximiliano.
So, Maximiliano, it's your turn. It was a pleasure to be part of this panel, to share this panel to Marcos, Hugo, José Manuel, and with the audience. I don't know how many people we have connected, but it's a pleasure being part of ACP. My congratulations on your program, covering so many areas of our work. Our continent has a lot, there's a lot of work to be done, and I think that these annual meetings are great. Let me tell you that in Chile, we have made great progress in the last month. Only in 1 month, we passed 2 laws, one regarding intellectual property, trademark, design, trade secrets, and also a new law for the Madrid Protocol. So these are 2 very important aspects that we need to mention. It was a big change, so please pay attention to all these developments. Thank you very much for the invite. Thank you, Max. Well, I would like to thank you. I'm not a member of ACP, but I know that because of all the information I get, apparently ACP is more active than the European version. I congratulate you on your work. Thank you very much for having me in this seminar. I didn't know Maximiliano, but it's always positive to share different approaches. And then Hugo really liked the last part of your presentation when you mentioned the black swan. I knew about the first part, but the second part of your presentation, I really like that. About the lessons learned. And that fact about having everything double. In some cases, some brains should be double just to try to make one. Okay, thank you. I would like to thank CP. I would like to congratulate José Manuel and Maximiliano for the presentations. And I believe that this pandemic, in a way, shows the need that we have to communicate. Communication between the private and the public sector. It is obvious that we need to work on this. This does not depend on supply and demand. We need the vaccines as soon as possible. So I think that we need to think of a scenario of incentives and trying to promote innovation, promote inventions, and a scenario in which we share risks. So for that to happen, we need this mutual cooperation between the public and the private sector. And also, we need solidarity between countries. Thank you very much. So thank you very much. I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations. Thank you, Maximiliano. Thank you, Otero and Gómez. I would like to highlight that the Justice Tribunal has issued this sentence just recently, and it was very useful for us in the debate. So thank you once again, and I would like to thank ACP for organizing this panel in this moment. Bye-bye.